I'm presenting today the results of our study looking at untimed efavirenz plasma concentrations in patients switching from brand to generic antiretroviral medication. I have no conflict of interest to declare. Antiretrovirals have reduced HIV-related morbidity and mortality, but those can cause extensive financial burden to both patient and the healthcare system. ARVs are still cost-effective, but healthcare providers are evaluating and considering a switch to cheaper medication options due to increased cost of drugs, rising use of therapy, and use of combination and triple therapy. ARVs in BC are provided at no cost by the publicly funded drug treatment program of the BC Centre for Excellence in HIV and AIDS. The DTP transitions from brand to generic ARVs when products become available and were reviewed by the Therapeutic Guideline Committee. A generic Efavirenz FTC-TDF combination pill was added to the DTP formulary in April 2018. Untimed plasma drug levels could be used retrospectively to confirm efavirenz levels have remained consistent after switching from brand to generic products. Drug levels in patients vary based on their pharmacokinetics, which can be affected by the type of drug, the patient's metabolism, drug absorption, drug interactions, food, and other variables. Depending on when the sample is drawn in relation to the medication time, the concentration varies based on a 24-hour PK curve, or 12 hours in case of a twice-daily regimen, and so on. Untimed drug levels do not take the medication dosing time in relation to plasma collection into consideration, but efavirenz has a very long elimination half-life of 40 to 55 hours after multiple doses, which lowers the risk of intra-patient variability. We selected samples from the DTP prescription database of patients being on efavirenz who consented to the use of their stored specimen and have switched from brand to generic efavirenz combination pill. Out of 120 patients who switched, we were able to include 99 participants with sufficient pre- and post samples. All of those had 3 pre-switch samples, with the last pre-switch sample being collected at least 1 month before the reported switch. The first post-switch sample had to be collected a minimum of 3 months after the reported switch, as the length of a general prescription is typically 3 months. Consequently, we avoided any samples that could have possibly been drawn while the patient was still using up their previous prescription and had not switched to the generic medication yet. We included 2 or 3 after-switch samples for our participants, but for one, where we were able to only include 1 sample due to insufficient volume of the second post-switch sample. All samples, pre- and post-switch, were at least 1 month apart. Samples were analyzed using a validated high-performance liquid chromatography method coupled with a triple-quadruple mass spectrometer. For the quantitation of the plasma, we precipitated the protein after internal standard addition, filtrated, and diluted the sample. Standards and blank samples for the calibration curve, as well as controls, were processed in the same way. The calibration curve consisted of 7 concentration levels ranging from 269 to 70,000 nanograms per milliliter, with an R-square of equal or greater than 0.995. Quality control samples were included in each run to monitor and confirm the accuracy. Displayed are efavirenz peaks of the lowest and highest standard, a quality control sample, and in the second row 3 samples at various concentration levels. On the right, you find an efavirenz calibration curve of one of the runs. For each patient, we calculated the average, minimum, and maximum concentration of their pre- and post samples and compared those using Wilcoxon's rank test. In addition, we looked at the CV of the samples per patient pre- and post-switch, evaluating the intra-patient variability. Efavirenz levels below 1,000 nanograms per milliliter are associated with an increased risk of virologic failure, whereas concentrations above 4,000 nanograms per milliliter are linked to an increased risk of central nervous system toxicity. We therefore categorized the samples falling within the ideal range of 1,000 to 4,000 nanograms per milliliter, above and below this range, and observed for changes in those categories when switching from brand to generic efavirenz medication. Lastly, we also compared the maximum efavirenz concentrations from our study to a Sustiva bioequivalence study. The Sustiva study was performed looking at efavirenz single pill taken with FTC and TDF versus a combination pill containing the same regimen. Their bioequivalence study looked at the maximum efavirenz concentration determined in a PK curve and the area under the curve for both groups. Our study population was at an average age of just under 53 years at the time before the switch, with 88 out of 99 being male. The viral load for 96 participants was undetectable, and the remaining 3 were below 100 copies per milliliter. The average CD4 count was 677. The regimen for both brand and generic combination pill was 600 mg efavirenz, 300 mg FTC, and 200 mg TDF. Patients were a median of 103 months on the brand regimen and just under 13 months on the generic regimen. The closest sampling time was a median of 98 days before the switch and a median of 133 days after the switch. We were able to include a total of 297 pre- and 249 post-switch samples, with 3 post-switch samples from 50 participants and 2 from 48 participants. We did not find a significant difference in concentrations before or after the switch, as shown in the first 3 graphs, neither for the average, the minimum, or the maximum concentration per patient, with p-values of 0.85, 0.61, and 0.80 respectively. The average of the CV for each patient's pre- and post-sample was at 14.4 and 15.1%, confirming a relatively low within-patient variability. The distribution of the CV for the post-switch arm is wider, partly due to the reduced number of samples. 80 participants' pre-switch average concentration was within the range of 1,000 to 4,000 nanograms per milliliter, with 74 or 93% of those not changing category after the switch. Similarly, 2 and 12 patients remained below or above the range, respectively, for both pre- and post samples. None of the participants' average concentrations changed from above to below or vice versa when switching to the generic formulation. The Sustiva bioequivalence study had 45 healthy individuals enrolled, and pharmacokinetics analysis was performed to receive a full 24-hour PK curve, where they compared the maximum concentrations in the area under the curve as suggested for bioequivalence studies. There was no significant difference for the maximum concentration between the single and combination pill. The maximum efavirenz concentrations found in our study, though not being the overall maximum concentration of a PK curve, were only slightly higher, with the generic pill being closer to the previously determined maximum concentration. In conclusion, untimed drug levels from leftover samples are easy to access and can be helpful comparing brand versus generic medication in a clinical setting. Untimed drug levels of medication with long elimination half-life could be used as a tool in instances where bioequivalence studies are not available. Patients switching from brand to generic efavirenz formulation maintained consistent efavirenz drug concentrations as measured in untimed plasma samples. This further supports the decision to use generic formulation where available in order to achieve cost savings to the healthcare system. I would like to thank the study participants, the BCCFE, specifically the laboratory group shown here, and the CAR committee for giving me the opportunity to present our data. Thanks for listening in.